Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Forney. Dr. Forney is the Director of Toxicology at the Lucas County Coroner's Office, also an Associate Professor in Pathology and Allied Health at the University of Toledo Health Services. His hobby, I guess this is a hobby, is studying the impairment from alcohol and other abused drugs. You couldn't take up modeling, huh? Dr. Forney, please welcome him.
No, actually, I played golf once.
Once?
It was in Terre Haute, Indiana, where I was born, and the golf course is around the baseball diamond. They have a little baseball team there, and it's a round thing. And the first hole is a dog leg to the left around this thing, and the ninth hole is over here on your right. Well, I was on the green and won. The ninth green. And the ball came in like that and bounced, and there were four guys on the green playing, and they, where's that coming from? So golf is not my hobby, and lots of people are happy about that. I'm going to be real brief here, famous last words. Coroner, by the time we get these individuals, you say, well, it's too late, what's the deal? Well, the deal is, this is a phrase, maybe you've heard it before in terms of medical examination, and that is, it's a place where death delights to help the living. And so everything we do is for the living. We occasionally do for justice for the decedents, that's true. But really our motivation and why we do this is to help the living. And unless we get the word out to different people as terms of what's going on, we're wasting our time. And so I really appreciate the invitation. I appreciate Sheriff Tharp and what he's doing. And Fred, you had me on the air one morning. I appreciate that. Anyway, I want to tell you, I've been a toxicologist practicing for 45 years, never seen anything like this. You've heard that. There's just never anything like this. You say, well, they're heroin epidemic, nothing like this. Nothing where you come in every day and you got bodies piling up. Let me just show you how this thing has grown so you'll appreciate what I'm going to tell you about this year. In 2010, I signed out 8 heroin deaths. In 2011, 15. In 2012, 31. 8, 15, 31. In 2013, 80. In 2014, 145, and last year, 215. And so far this year, we're about 30 to 50% above last year. So this thing is going like this. Nationwide, I'm on an expert panel, a national expert panel. The White House Office of Drug Control Policy has a representative, the CDC, the AMA, the ADA, and 3 of the pharmaceutical companies that manufacture opioids. Ohio is the worst in the nation per capita. There's more deaths per capita in Ohio than anywhere else. California is the only state that has actually more deaths, but we're more per capita. And so this is I consider ground zero. And you all, you didn't ask for this problem, but because you're dentists, because you have prescribing privileges, because you see patients and families, welcome to our world. The community can do very little about this, but you and I, can. So a couple of things. First of all, when Mike DeWine said a 35-year-old white male, he's absolutely right. I run the statistics every year. The average age that we do 21 counties. That's 19 in Northwest Ohio, just take the corner, plus 2 in southeastern Michigan. In those 19 counties, average age is 39, and about 80%, until this year, about 80% were men, and they're mostly Caucasian, 89% Caucasian. They're mostly suburban, so he's absolutely right. In the last year, we have moved Several years ago, as you watch these heroin numbers grow, what I didn't give you during those years were the methadone deaths and the Percocet deaths. But we moved completely away from Percocet and methadone. It was all heroin until over a year ago, it began to be fentanyl. And the fentanyl is replacing the heroin. And to begin with, we saw heroin plus fentanyl in the same death, using both. And when we get the material at the scene and we analyze it, we find that there's heroin and fentanyl in the actual powder or in the residue from the syringe. Now, you have to appreciate something. In a can of beer, you know how much alcohol's in a can of beer? Now, there's craft beers, and there's, some beers are 12% and some are 3%. There's about 10 to 15 grams of alcohol in one beer. 10 to 15 grams. What's the dose of fentanyl in a hospital? 125 micrograms. Micrograms. So if a person's drunk, he's got 100, 200 grams of alcohol. That's like finding the moon. If toxicology were astronomy, it's the moon. And I can teach a 4-year-old to find the moon and not confuse it. It'll be a reliable answer. Okay. Finding fentanyl is like finding Pluto. Okay, now why do I say this? You do a drug screen, probably you're not going to get a fentanyl answer. It's very difficult to do. We can do it. We have a very sophisticated, very expensive facility at the coroner's office. Most hospitals can't. If you get, if you see a medical record and you see a drug screen and it says opiates negative, what you just learned was that there's no codeine and there's no morphine. It doesn't detect Percocet. It would only detect Vicodin if the person had a very big Vicodin. There may be a little cross-reactivity. And fentanyl, just forget it. Okay, so what's happened? Well, in the last 2 months, we now have nine deaths that are not fentanyl, but they're analogs. You heard him talk about carfentanil. Well, we can measure carfentanil. Haven't seen it. Now, other places in the state, they've seen it, and they've got a number of seizures of carfentanil. Okay, 125 micrograms of fentanyl. How much is that? Well, 1 grain of salt weighs 60 micrograms. So that's 2 grains of salt. And these pushers are mixing. The first fentanyls that I saw, when it was heroin and fentanyl, the therapeutic range measured in the blood is 1 to 2 nanograms per mil, billionth, nanograms per mil in the blood. Those early deaths, we'd see heroin and I'd see 4 nanograms per mil of fentanyl, or maybe 5. And then all of a sudden, I saw one that was 25, and there was no metabolite. That means rapid death. And then I saw a 35, and shortly after that, they were in the 80s, and then 120. These are huge fentanyl doses. Well, when you move to something like carfentanil, we have 3 deaths that are 3-methylfentanyl. I need to know about that. You don't need to know about that, but it's the same thing. It's more potent than fentanyl. And 2 grains of salt are a dose of fentanyl. And these people are mixing this stuff, and by the way, fentanyl is absorbed through the skin very readily, right? That's why I'm sorry. You know how to use microphones. I don't know how to use.
Just stay close to it.
Stay close to it? Oh, okay. See, he's professional. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying? It's absorbed through the skin, right? That duragesic patches, It goes right through the skin, right? And so when you get carfentanil or 3-methylfentanyl or acetylfentanyl, we got 4 fumarate fentanyl deaths. You know, and you go, and so what's happening is there's very few heroin deaths. Now it's mostly fentanyl, and now the fentanyls are moving into these other products. There is nobody in town that can measure these things in the blood except us. And we need the Hubble telescope to be able to do it. And we have 2, by the way. We have 2 Hubble telescopes. It's called a liquid chromatograph, mass spectrometer, mass spectrometer, mass spectrometer. 3 mass spectrometers in tandem in each instrument. So anyway, that's where we're going with this thing. I want to stop with 2 comments. We say in addiction that addiction comes from weakness in one of 4 areas, and it impacts all 4 areas in your patients. Okay, and the 4 areas are physical. They can have a physical problem, emotional, social, and spiritual. And typically there's one of these areas where people who start using drugs, that's their motivation. But once they start using drugs, it affects all 4 areas, right, and the impact. So if we're going to fix this, we got to fix it in all 4 areas. It can't just be physical rehab. That's why these officers are so important in the relationships, because that's the social component. But there also needs to be an emotional and a spiritual component. And I'll tell you how I know this is happening in this group. We almost never, I think last year, I maybe signed out 1 death that was a single drug. They're all multiple drugs. There are 4, 5, 8, 10 different drugs. Fentanyl or heroin will be among them. But almost in the majority of them, there's an antidepressant. And in many of them, there's a benzodiazepine, a tranquilizer, something like Xanax. Almost all of them have Benadryl, diphenhydramine. As a matter of fact, in the powder or in the residue, you'll see diphenhydramine is there from the pusher, you know, because they get nausea with opiates and they get itching, and so they put in an antihistamine, you know, to deal with that, you know, and then there'll be other drugs. And so what I think happens in some of these cases is you may not even be talking about an opiate, and yet a prescription can add to the effect of an opiate. You know, and if we don't have pharmacy and others involved analyzing this combination and helping these people, they have emotional problems, you know, it's not pretty, then I think we're not going to be able to solve this. So the DART program is just right on target in terms of what's needed, but we need you. We need you to convince your patients that this stuff, if you're going to prescribe an opiate, that it's dangerous, and that you prescribe little. I'm not responsible for your guidelines, but follow the guidelines, or just a few doses, you know, a short-term thing, rather than to get beyond that. And then understand that these people need help, and they come to your office. And my very last thing is, you know, those addicts, they drive. They drive. We're seeing traffic deaths. And sometimes it's not the addict that's dead. This is a problem, you know, and we got to do something about it. Thank you.